Order, order. I think it would be helpful for the purposes of our session if I just explain that I've almost lost my voice. But given the importance of the inquiry which we are commencing today, I can assure you that you are in good hands with my committee members, and we will get through all the questions that we wish to. And I think it's also important to point out at the outset that it's not for our committee to look at whether or not there should or should not be HS2. It's to look at the role of Parliament and to look at the role of environmental sustainability in all of this. So with that briefest of introduction, I'll hand you over to my colleague, Dr. Alan Whitehead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Janelle. Well, I haven't lost my voice, so it's very helpful in that respect. Could I ask from the panel generally, to start with, what you consider in the context of what you heard about the remit of our inquiry, what you think might be the main environmental advantages and indeed disadvantages of the proposed HS2 scheme? I suspect you may have some views either side of the advantages and disadvantages, but perhaps you could just set out where you think that balance of advantage and disadvantage lies.
Well, I think one of the reasons that HS2 is so environmentally damaging is because of the fact that it's such high speed. So that has determined to a great extent the route that has been chosen. Because if it were to go at a lesser speed, it could have gone on another route. And I think it's important to remember that very high speed produces much higher carbon emissions. So I think that's a major factor, and also you can't use existing transport corridors either, so the environmental damage to the countryside is much greater because of this choice of high speed.
Yeah, high-speed rail would better put as ultra-high-speed rail. The entire design has been predicated by 250 miles an hour design speed being plucked out of the air, though they're now saying the trains all run at 225. You just look at HS1 and Eurostar, that maxes out at 186, which allows it to do bends. And because HS2 has been designed for 250 miles an hour, it makes it far more disruptive to the natural environment and communities because it can't really go round sensitive sites, whether that's woodland or habitats or even floodplains, and of course communities themselves. As Emma said, one of the main problems is the carbon footprint that it will leave. HS2 Limited have said, well, it will be broadly carbon neutral, but the problem is that the amount of electricity you need goes up exponentially with speed, and as a result you'll be using about 3 times the amount of energy. So in reality you will see carbon emissions increase, because even when they say it could be broadly carbon neutral, they completely ignore all the embedded carbon from constructing the line, and of course the associated roadworks and tailbacks, etc., that will happen as a result of construction.
Councillor Rose or Mr. Steele, want to add anything?
Yes, I entirely agree, and I think actually if one looks at the actual the route itself, and I know we're not discussing the route itself, but if one looks at it, there are peculiarities in the route which could have been so easily avoided if the speed had been more circumspect, because there is very little to be gained by the speed itself, and that has brought about its own impact on our communities, where in some instances it just charges and ploughs through villages which it could have been avoided if it had followed an existing transport corridor. I think that's an extremely important point.
Thank you.
Well, to answer your question, I think carbon savings remain evident from the analysis in the environmental statement, at least at the operational phase. They are obviously offset by the carbon embedded in the construction of the project. And these calculations are quite difficult, but certainly what the environmental statement suggests is that over what you would expect would be the life of the infrastructure, which is, of course, a very, very long time, even then the carbon benefits from operation outweigh the disbenefits embedded in construction. The second point I would say in its favour, and that simply arises from the fact that rails are a less carbon-intensive mode of transport, and some diversion from other modes is brought about by it. The second thing I think it does, which is very helpful in what broader sustainability terms, is it gives an accessibility stimulus to cities. Rail can do that. The alternative, if it was conceived to be an alternative, building more roads, tends to do the opposite and encourage development in the urban periphery and so on, as we're all familiar with. If I may just comment on the question of speed, the analysis we've prepared and published a year and a half ago shows that the impact, and there is an impact of speed on the carbon and energy question, but it's not as great as perhaps people make out or have implied. Reducing the top speed from 360 kilometres an hour to 300 kilometres an hour, which is the Channel Tunnel rail link speed, reduces the energy consumption by 19%. And the overall carbon impact is significantly less than that, and indeed that figure, which I could find if I had a minute, is in the environmental statement. I believe it's around 7%.
Well, you've mentioned, indeed, Mr. Steer, the environmental statement itself, and I think you mentioned some particular issues of setting the carbon savings in the environmental statement against other factors. What generally do you think a panel on as far as the possible major shortcomings or otherwise the environmental statement? Do you think it is a satisfactory statement of the environmental circumstances, bearing in mind what has been said about the pluses and minuses, or are there, in your view, particular shortcomings with it?
I think there's many shortcomings with the environmental statement. I think, just touching on carbon, and to add to what Mr. Steer said, I think it has been widely accepted that HS2 is not a sort of carbon-saving project. I mean, just to say, the forecasting figures which HS2 Limited uses forecast 120 years into the future, and that is the way that they can conclude that there is a broadly negative carbon footprint. However, standard practice in the DFT is to forecast 60 years ahead. And if you were to do that, it would be a different picture. I mean, just to say that the airplane and the car weren't even invented 120 years ago. So how we can look forward 120 years and be able to predict what the carbon emissions will be like at that point, I think it's giving quite a skewed picture. And I think, the carbon emissions from construction are pretty appalling, and they should be taken into consideration, and not just looking at the carbon emissions on operation. But even then, you're relying hugely on the predicted passenger numbers, and I mean, they've been broadly overstated in our view.
Yeah.
Sorry, could I just come in and ask about the passenger numbers and ask about the reliability of the passenger numbers that are actually available?
Well, the passenger numbers that we've been given in HS2's business case, they're relying on a huge increase in business passengers, for one thing. But if you look at the evidence that's available, it shows that business travel is actually not increasing by huge amounts. And that's probably largely due to changes in technology and the way people use technology instead of meetings. And the other thing is that the passenger projections rely on this, to a large degree, to modal shift, and a lot of the modal shift is from less polluting forms of transport. So I think it's 95% of the predicted passengers will be either new journeys or will be transferring from existing rail. There's a very, very tiny proportion predicted to transfer from air or
1%.
car. It's 1% from air and 4% from car. So you're relying on this huge, amount of new journeys, which doesn't seem to fit with reducing the carbon footprint.
When you look at passenger numbers, there's two different aspects to look at. One is in relation to the carbon footprint, and for example, in working out the carbon footprint with HS2 Limited assumed 100% occupancy of their trains. But with cars, they've assumed 30% occupancy just to fiddle these figures. And that's what you've seen from the start. You've seen grossly inflated passenger forecasts. And what happened in the latest business case was they were forced to bring the number of passengers down. But because the business case, the benefit cost ratio would come down even below where it is, they decided to up the proportion of business users so that they could show more benefits, because the entire business case is predicated on the issue of speed. They're saying now that speed is completely irrelevant, but it determines everything, because you're saying that still all time on trains is wasted. Therefore, if you go more quickly, you've saved money for the economy effectively, and that goes back significantly to the passenger forecast, because obviously you're multiplying those numbers by the number of passengers who are forecast. In terms of the actual reliability of the environmental statement, it is simply not fit for purpose at all in any shape or form. It is contradictory. There are surveys, for example, that haven't been done. There are surveys that are missing. And many of the surveys are incomplete because they were done at the wrong time of year, etc. And this is a theme going throughout HS2, like Blackpool through a stick of rock, in that everything seems to have been rushed through and therefore done inadequately to meet unrealistic parliamentary timetables.
Could I just briefly come back on the question of passenger numbers, because the chairman is slightly impaired in being able to speak, and we're both West Midlands MPs, and the West Midlands cities have seen a very significant increase in rail travel in the last decade. You take a city like Coventry, there's a 30% increase in rail travel over the last 10 years. Are you saying that that's plateaued?
Well, the latest figures for long distance intercity rail, which is what HS2 is intended to be, it's not intended to assist commuter or suburban train lines, because people simply won't be able to get on it because it's between four cities. It's not stopping all the way up and down.
But would you expect the trend from the West Midlands cities of increased intercity rail travel to plateau or increase?
Well, the figures show that intercity, so that's between cities, long distance, is plateauing. It's going up for commuter and short suburban journeys, but not for the longer journeys. And that's from Network Rail's own figures. They were released during judicial review proceedings.
How do we define commuting? Because if the journey time comes down to 31 minutes from Birmingham International to Euston, would we consider that commuting?
Well, the figures for the West Coast mainline usage show it's running at 52% capacity at peak times at the moment. So there's plenty of capacity for people who want to go up and down.
But the pinch points are route, isn't it?
Well, there's other ways you could solve the pinch points, which have much less severe environmental consequences, I would add, because that's what this committee is here to look at.
But do you think it's going to plateau?
Well, that's what the figures seem to be suggesting for the longer distance. I mean, I think for commuter lines, I'm not a rail expert, but from what I've seen from the figures, it seems to be increasing for commuters into all the main cities. And so it's not just cities affected by HS2, it's all around the country.